Sika na Metelkovi pogovarjala o tem in onem v posluh.
I would like you to comment on these far-reaching changes that have been going on in the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, obviously there were two wars that had far-reaching consequences in Afghanistan, Iraq, then it was Arab Spring, financial crisis, refugee crisis. I mean, from the general perspective of the period in the post-war, post-Second World War time that Hobsbawm, whom you refer to in some of your articles, characterizes the golden age of capitalism. Usually the next phase is characterized as a neoliberal capitalism. What kind of capitalism are we living nowadays? How do you see its main traits and trends?
I'm glad you asked me a small question. I think it is a continuation of a crisis that began in 73. And neoliberalism is only one dimension of that. I think that there are two crises, I think, underlying everything. One that most people are aware of is the ecological crisis, which is, I think, much more of a crisis than people realize. Syria had a terrible drought for 5 years before 2011. One of the reasons for the mass of African migrants is also because of the climate, which is making subsistence farming more and more difficult. There are also social reasons, socio-economic reasons as well. But certainly the ecological crisis is a major one. The other is the crisis of laboring societies. Trump, and to a lesser degree Sanders' campaign, have brought to light is something that some of us knew for a very long time, which is that the wages of American workers has not risen since 1973. A lot of people don't realize that. One of the reasons why the crisis in America was as bad as it was is because this loss of income was compensated for in the United States by people owning houses. And houses were seen as an investment, and you could borrow on houses. So people could continue a lifestyle that was really out of proportion to what their wages were. The crisis of 2007-2008 began as a housing crisis. Another part is that what you referred to as the golden age of capitalism is characterized by the relative success of state-inflected or state-directed economies. The golden age of capitalism is also a period of really remarkable growth in the Soviet Union during that period as well. And towards the end of that period, in some of the allies of the Soviet Union, East Germany and Czechoslovakia, in the second half of the 60s are really moving. It all stops in the 70s. But this isn't only an issue for America and Europe. I think it was very much an issue for what was called the Third World. And statist modes of organization really stopped being so efficacious. There was a United Nations report that most people didn't seem to pay attention to. Maybe I'm wrong. In 2002, It was called the United Nations Arab Human Development Report. It was put together by scholars from Arab countries who argued that since the late 70s or early 80s, basically the Arabic-speaking space had declined enormously economically, and most people were unaware of that. The only place where the decline was as great was sub-Saharan Africa. But people knew about sub-Saharan Africa. They knew nothing about the Arabic-speaking space. The left allied itself with incredible dictatorships. When in 2011, when the uprising against Mubarak in Egypt, I noticed left and left liberals kept on saying it was Mubarak's authoritarianism had something to do with the fact that he was allied with the United States. But the secret police structure he inherited from Sadat, who inherited from Nasser. It's Nasser. The secret police structures in all of these Arabic countries was incredibly oppressive. In Syria, my understanding is that it was reorganized hand in glove with the KGB, because after all, Syria was the closest ally of the Soviet Union. And the left allied itself with these terrible dictatorships. And as long as it wasn't Saudi Arabia and didn't wear long robes and didn't call itself a king, the idea was that this is progressive. You had in the Middle East a combination of a ecological crisis and a terrible political crisis. It looked differently in different Arabic countries. Tunisia had the best developed institutions of civil society. So you have important and powerful labor union confederations in Tunisia, which played an extremely important role as a counterpower to the Islamists. In Egypt, the only counterpower is the army. Even though the Western media went gaga over the fact that everybody was using their smartphones, that's fine for getting people into squares, not fine in terms of an organization. They have no organization. And I'm not sure what kind of appeal they had. I'm not sure. I mean that I'm agnostic on that. But when Morsi began to create a dictatorship from within, and people forget that when they say he was democratically elected, so was Hitler. When Morsi began the dictatorship from within, most people welcomed the military, so the choice was dictatorships. It's a terrible choice. Syria began differently, and Assad brutally cracked down in the most brutal way imaginable from the very beginning. The general crisis, which I think has been going on for a long time, is now expressed as the resurgence of the right. Putin is basically a corrupt right-wing government. Poland, Hungary, maybe Austria. People forget fascism, or that kind of real authoritarianism, began kind of on the margins of Europe between the wars before it went into Germany. And we'll see if the same thing happens again. So you have that in Europe. You have the Islamists, who are a right-wing movement. It's a right-wing fundamentalist movement. I don't understand why people have that much difficulty understanding it. They're so afraid of becoming orientalizing that they really don't do any political analysis anymore. Mm-hmm. It's a right-wing reactionary movement. Has nothing to do with tradition. It calls itself traditional. You know, the Nazis had nothing to do with the German Middle Ages, but they used to like to set it up. I think we could see, unless a new left is formed, and I'm not that optimistic, a militarization of society. You'll see this in Brazil first. I mean, that's what they're doing right now, is trying to return the military dictatorship. And so many people have been rendered superfluous that the only way of controlling them is military.
Maybe just to touch a little bit more in detail on the situation in Europe. Greece seems to serve as a good example how the ruling class, the higher echelons of capital, have dealt on the one hand with the perceived threat of Syriza, not so much a real threat, but a kind of political potentiality that had to be, it seems, smashed at the very beginning to set an example. And on the other hand, a force that down on the ground seems to be much stronger and a much bigger threat, the Golden Dawn. And it's a trend that has been repeating itself in other European countries. It seems that fascists and radical right-wing movements know very well what they're doing and are very successful in this, while the left-wing movements, while very enthusiastically supported and invested with a great deal of hope, have actually failed miserably. What's your view on these dynamics?
It's easier for the right wing.
It is, yeah.
It's really quite easy. You can make up these slogans that have no relation to actual socioeconomic reality, but they'll appeal to a lot of people. The left has been too out of touch with socioeconomic reality for too long. It's simply not enough to be against the banks. It's really insufficient. The left has no vision anymore. It hasn't had a vision for a while. As long as traditional Marxism made sense, there was a vision. And even people who would never have called themselves Marxists moved in the wake of this movement. There is no workers' movement anymore. And it's not just a matter of parties. And that has to do with this transformation of work. Mm-hmm. It's not that the labor unions simply were corrupt and sold out. Sure, they did. But that wasn't the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem was as early as the 1960s, people sensed that the utopian goals of the working class movement no longer had any appeal. They didn't speak to people. And I think the efflorescence of theory, which dates from that time, I mean, theory had been dead, except for, a few little outposts, especially the Frankfurt School. They were like notes in a bottle. The efflorescence of theory, I think, without people being aware of it, was itself a response to a conceptual crisis. And that didn't bear very much fruit. Certainly, I think the theoretical reconsideration was strongest in Germany, and that has the least effect outside of Germany. The level of discussion was much higher in Germany than France or England, but never had the same resonance as someone like Althusser, which is a very sad statement. You had the efflorescence of theory, but you also had, and all of this was kind of semi-conscious historically, you had the reification of anti-colonial struggle, which shouldn't be confused with supporting anti-colonial struggle. Sure, anti-colonial struggle should have been supported. It was extremely important for people to be liberated from these colonial structures. But these were movements, essentially, that would allow the previously colonized areas to enter on a kind of an equal footing to everybody else. But that's very different than going beyond capitalism. That doesn't mean that it's bad, that it shouldn't be supported. And the almost religious fervor with which people greeted the anti-colonial struggle, I think in itself was an indication of a deficit, that the working class was no longer the revolutionary subject. A bad consequence of that was that concrete political analyses and high theory began to be separated from one another. Concrete political analysis should have looked at countries, let's say like Algeria, and really figured out what was going there. Nothing. They were black boxes. They were black boxes. The one anti-colonial struggle that lasted the longest and I think very clearly indicates the limitations of the global order today is the ANC, the struggle against apartheid. Mandela didn't want another Algeria. He didn't want simply to slaughter whites. And the Communist Party was very strong in the ANC. And one reason why it's significant is because a lot of people don't fully realize that communists tend not to randomly kill civilians. Once they're in power, it's a different thing. But communist movements tend not to use that kind of terrorist tactic. By terrorist, what I mean is really looking at soft targets. The ANC under Mandela moved away from that, but they couldn't escape the neoliberal global order. So that I think the communists had hoped that there would be a kind of what the communists were good at was to create national capital. That's really what China, with the Soviet Union, to a lesser degree Vietnam because it came later, were about. It created national capital. Not possible anymore in South Africa. So that tells you something about a different world than that of the state-centric order that is called the golden age of capitalism. It was the golden age of state-centrism.
We have seen in recent years certain resurgence of extreme right-wing movements, also pretty extreme right-wing rhetoric in traditional center-right parties, for example. And I think this brings us to a theme you have written quite a lot about, which is the theme of anti-Semitism. And what struck me as interesting was that while reading your articles and finding out about this idea about how anti-Semitism differed to greater extent from other, let's say, racist ideas, because it tended to be dependent upon upon commodity fetishism, the difference between, the abstract nature of the commodity and the concrete nature of the commodity, the abstract nature of the commodity being personified in the figure of the Jew. But there are certain issues at hand concerning, I think, recent developments in the last few years, which make me question and, let's say, be curious about what you would think about certain modern phenomena. For example, it seems that, or at least I would really like for you to clarify this to me, that your theory of anti-Semitism is somehow historically specific. Because, in the sense, one could imagine also, for example, the Chinese population in Indonesia, for example, who are also the mediators of Chinese capital to Indonesia, to have the same structural role as Jews did, for example, in Europe. So my question would be whether this anti-Semite matrix is something you think you could apply to also other cases, that is, that it is a common scapegoat configuration in certain situation. So this is, I guess, one part of the question. And the other part of the question would be, we know very well about the alliance between, the extreme right and industrial capital, and its, its attack on financial capital as personified by the Jews of Europe. But right now we have a current of anti-Semitism in the new extreme right movements in Europe, which at the same time is not to such a wide extent against financial capital. That is, for example, one could imagine Orban's Hungary, where there is not such a big attack on international financial structure, yet at the same time, quite a lot of elements of anti-Semitism are, being brought up to the surface. So this is kind of my two-part question.
The Chinese in Indonesia are different. It's more like the Jews in the Middle Ages. So they're the recipient of pogroms, and many Chinese were killed in 1965. But that's different than an ideology of global domination. So immediate economic is not the same as global domination. Global domination can fix itself on finance capital, but need not.
But for example, we have there is also a common theme like this recurring in extreme Islamic fundamentalist ideology. That is, where there is this hegemonic West that seems to embody precisely the characteristics that were seen as typically Jewish in anti-Semite ideology.
It's not the West, it's America and Israel. I would distinguish. And America is frequently in right-wing circles attributed with many of the attributes of the Jews. There's a very strong anti-Americanism, which was European fascist. And it was about the Americans being global and shallow and without culture and manipulating everything. So it's not the West. It's America and Israel. And America is controlled by Israel. Within that framework, I mean, there are forms of anti-Zionism that are clearly anti-Semitic. Not all criticisms of Israel are anti-Semitic, in spite of what Netanyahu says. But nevertheless, there are very strongly anti-Semitic forms. Orban talks about global conspiracy, the shadow conspiracy that's controlling everything, and usually is named Soros. But he uses that language, very much so. And I think what you'll find eventually with some right-wing fascist circles is the migrants themselves it's the shadow power that's sending them into Europe in order to undermine European Christianity, European ethnic living together identity. I don't think that anti-Semitism only existed then. It's very strong now. Very strong, actually. It's very strong in France. All Jewish institutions have to be guarded. Jewish schools, synagogues, everything has to be guarded. This is France. The land of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Jews are feeling very uncomfortable in Europe. So did I miss part of what you were trying to ask me?
Actually, what I was aiming towards was the question of, on the one hand, what you've already answered now, whether Nazi anti-Semitism was to a larger extent historically specific, and there's also another part of this question I want to explore here, which is there seems still to be this sort of discontinuity between this, let's say, idea of this dark Jewish conspiracy and this Jewish form of abstraction, dominating the world and so on. And on the other hand, between, let's say, the more traditionally racist biological part of anti-Semite discourse even then. So would you say these are like two teams that came together in a pretty contingent way, or
not contingent, but they came together. So the Nazis could rely on the other one when they went to Eastern Europe. The Nazis didn't have to do very much. If they were in Lithuania, for example, the Lithuanians did it. If they were in Ukraine, the Ukrainians did it. The massacre of Babi Yar, where 33,000 Jews were killed in one weekend, that was mainly Ukrainian Hilfstruppen, auxiliary troops for the Nazis. So the two came together in a very explosive mix that was a little unfortunate for European Jewry.
So now moving on to some not so dark but still quite unfortunate topics. So right now, not to speak only of the current European right, we have this large wave of protests going on in France. And one of the demands of this protest movement is not to, to stop an attack on the current French working week, which is generally 35 hours plus. You get paid extras for any sort of overtime you do over 34 hours, and it seems working time connects very well with the topic you've written about, which is time in capitalism. And here I would like you to address two topics which are, let's say, of a certain importance for our Slovene public, because they represent two, let's say, trends or ways of thinking which were and still are quite popular with the young left here. And on the one hand, we have the Italian post-operaismo analysis of post-Fordism, and on the other hand, we have this very recent trend, which is on the left, especially put forward by Nick Cernicek, which is the idea of accelerationism, if you've maybe heard about it. Regarding, for example, working time right now, as we said, in France, they're demanding their work week not to be lengthened and so on. Well, for example, in the ideas the accelerationists put forward right now is, demand full automation in production, demand universal basic income, more free time, and so on. And my question would be very simply, do you think such a compromise can come to be at a recent time? Does it solve any sort of, let's say, structural problem, or does it just alleviate the current conditions? And whether we can actually even be put in a position where such an option would be possible.
Which option now?
This less work, universal basic income option.
I think we have to move in that direction. Look, if the goal of traditional Marxism was full employment for everybody, that's never going to happen. That's why a lot of people, Naomi Klein, a bunch of them, think that it's possible to return to the golden age. No, that's impossible. The working class is not growing. For a while, people thought it is growing, but just somewhere else, like China. Chinese working class, to the best of my knowledge, stopped growing in 2004, 2005. So now maybe the Vietnamese working class will expand and stop. The Bangladeshi working class, has expanded. It will stop. That is, it's not linear, but that's the long-term trajectory. Now, what the 35-hour week people are fighting against is that, of course, capital, or the capitalists, because it's all capital, want maximum what they call flexibility. And they claim that anything else leads to stagnation. The only problem is that they lead to stagnation too. And they've never solved that. They've never solved that problem. Where are the great growth rates? The United States, which is about as flexible as you could get in terms of labor, is doing a little better than Europe. But that's because we haven't had this austerity that the Europeans have. But it's doing a little better, not much better. The two could be together. See, the problem with the accelerationists is I tried to argue that capital has a double movement of acceleration and reconstitution. And it's through that double movement that you get a growing tension and contradiction. The accelerationists are just taking one side of it, and they think you can run with it. They're the successors to post-industrial theorists of the 1960s. Yet, there's an aspect there that I'm sympathetic to. In the long run, the left is going to have to try to imagine a society in which individual reproduction is not wage-based. And yet, where people aren't just playing video games 75 hours a week. That's what they're going to have, people are going to have to figure out. I certainly don't have a plan. That will have to emerge out of trial and error and practice. I didn't satisfy you, I can tell from your face.
No, I think that what you said was to the point. But regarding this question of employment, whether full employment, less employment, partial employment, we see like this new trend that is quite common in Europe. That is, to put it very, very bluntly, working hours don't finish. When your formal working hours finish. There is this this sort of post-Fordist kind of work, which is basically something
24 hours.
Yeah, which is
Yeah, I mean, what seems to be another issue that the left has not come up with an efficient solution is that, as Nate said, the workday does not stop when you leave the office. Usually the office is your life as such. I mean, so instead of an 8-hour day or maybe 7-hour day, as we said in the case of France, you now have a 24-hour workday basically. And this actually poses a completely different problem for the worker struggles, and it must anticipate different forms of workers' organization, self-consciousness. And do you see any theoretical or practical work that is showing the right way to go?
No, but I agree that it's a serious problem, but it isn't for the workers. It's for white-collar people. Those are the people who are hooked in electronically. Workers are not. Workers are not hooked in the same way. What we're getting is a blurring of what had been bourgeois distinctions between public and private. And we're getting that blurring in many respects. One, a very important one, is what the two of you have just mentioned, that you don't finish work when you finish work.
Yeah.
You always have to be available, and there are companies that really demand that, let's say, when you go on vacation, you have to be reachable. And then there are people who internalize that. I know I've internalized it. I take my computer and I check my email, always. And I think that's part of it. Another part, and I know these don't seem to have anything to do with one another, but, there are lots of things, at least in the States on the radio, trying to tell young people that, when you apply for a job, your employer is going to Google you, and they're going to look at everything you ever posted on Facebook and everything. So don't post certain kind of pictures. But that people do is also from a completely different direction, an indication that these bourgeois separations, which I think were positive, that these bourgeois separations are being blurred. One of the great things about urban life used to be anonymity. People would say it's cold and I want the warmth of the village, but the village was everybody knew you and your parents and your grandparents all the way back. You couldn't breathe. The city, you could breathe. That's getting to be less and less the case.
So, I think we're slowly reaching our time limit. So maybe.
Oh, we've reached it.
So maybe just to conclude, if you have some, let's say,
concluding words of wisdom.
Some concluding words of wisdom. Something to make the Slovenian left a bit happier. Maybe some advice or something like that.
I think we have a lot of work to do.
None paid.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.